Hi, so today we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution, how it started, what the causes were, the changes it caused in Britain, and the impact of the Industrial Revolution and what it did to the British economy and British society. So we're going to start by looking at the period before the Industrial Revolution, just before, about 1700 to 1760, and we're going to begin with agriculture because it was such an important part of society prior to the Industrial Revolution. So, in around 1700, the population of England and Wales was around 5 million, and the majority of these people lived in the countryside, working the land in subsistence farms. And farmers were making use of a wide range of new techniques, such as crop rotation and mixing fodder crops, such as turnips and clover, with their usual crop. These new methods allowed them to sustain large herds of livestock with fodder during the winter months, instead of having to slaughter them. Previously, they had to kill everything for the winter. So this, combined with irrigation, was leading to a positive cycle of increased productivity, which is massively boosting the food supply. So you see huge advances in agriculture to boost the food supply prior to this period. And also around this time, the manufacturing industry, taking a look at this, so those that didn't work in agriculture often worked in small-scale cottage industries. Now, these small bases of textile or artisan manufacturing were based in homes or communities and made products that rarely travelled outside of those communities. And also, prior to 1760, the main sources of power were water wheels, windmills, and horsepower. So manufacturing that required powered machinery was relatively uncommon, so quite low productivity in small areas here. Now, one part of the British economy which was consistent before the Industrial Revolution was mining. And one thing that Britain did have in large abundance was coal. So even in the early 18th century, it was Britain's biggest export. But a problem that miners regularly faced with Britain's weather was that mines regularly flooded. So there were pumps previously, quite crude pumps to get the water out of the mines, but in 1712 James Newcomen invented the steam-driven piston engine and used this to design a pump to pump water out of the mines much more effectively than had been done previously. And this coal-powered steam-driven pump allowed miners to extract yet more coal, but also other elements like salt and iron, very, very key raw materials for the Industrial Revolution. So taking a look at these three, so mining, manufacturing and farming and the developments here, this created a few positive feedback loops that started to change society quite rapidly leading up to 1760. So the advances in agriculture created a food surplus, an overpopulation in the countryside, so there was a cheap workforce ready to be put to use. Increased population also surged demand for clothing and textiles, consumer goods, so here are the beginnings of consumer capitalism. And Newcomen's steam engine allowed more coal to be mined, as we've said, which allowed more steam engines to be produced and for increased mining of coal, so you've got this feedback loop there. And the coal did need moving around the country, all these materials goods needed moving around the country. And this encouraged the improvement of roads, which made it easier for goods to move around other goods and further stimulated the economy. That's that point there. So these factors altogether created a perfect storm, if you like, which created ideal conditions for what we will discuss in the next section of the presentation. So, industrialization and change. This is a period of rapid industrialization from the 100 or so years following on from 1760. So what is industrialization? So industrialization is the process by which an economy is transformed from primarily an agricultural one to one based on the manufacturing of goods. So looking at the increased population, advances in technology, and increased abundance of energy, we can see that the conditions were perfect for Britain to begin switching to an industrial economy by 1760. So let's take a look at all the elements that defined the Industrial Revolution. Beginning with a very, very key one, technology. So throughout the 18th century, Newcomen's steam engine, as we've discussed, this improved. The design improved and spread to become used in manufacturing as well as mining. There were over 2,000 of his steam engines in Britain by 1800. On top of that, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny in Lancashire in 1764, and this allowed one person to weave cloth with 8 spools of thread at once and revolutionised the textile industry. On top of that, John Kay's flying shuttle also contributed to advances in the textile industry. This was used to thread things at a distance. It was very, very good for increased productivity in textiles. So all these leaps in technology advanced the efficiency in manufacturing to create a huge surplus of manufactured goods, particularly textiles, particularly in industries like cotton. So in the early 19th century, moving on, all these changes led to changes in transportation. And in the early 19th century, steam locomotives were invented. And this resulted in the construction of railway tracks, connecting mining towns with manufacturing towns and ports. And 1761 saw the introduction of the canal system, which was used similarly to the railways, but mostly to transport coal using barges. And the increased access to iron allowed for strong iron bridges to be built for the first time, crossing wide rivers that had previously always been a barrier to the movement of goods and labour. So here you see a network of roads, as we mentioned previously, but also railways, canals, bridges, linking up the nation in a way that had never been seen prior to this period. So how did Westminster respond to all these changes? Taking a look at government policy. So the British government was responsible for investing in some of the infrastructure we've mentioned previously and allowing for the private construction of roads and railways, often by local councils or by even wealthy individuals would fund these constructions. The government also allowed immigration from Europe, France, Spain, Italy, and these skilled migrants brought knowledge that enhanced the manufacturing of certain goods and also brought unique product designs that were co-opted by British industrialists. And the British government also restricted the use of timber for industry, which this further stimulated an already booming coal industry and preserved some of Britain's woodland, which is good. Now, arguably the most important government policy is related to the enclosure of land. Now, so historically, most land in England and Wales was common ground that local people could use to farm or rent as a tenant from a local farmer or local lord. From the 1600s, the government had allowed groups of villagers to apply for an Enclosure Act that fenced off this land for private use, exclusive use. And one of the most important government policies was in 1801, when the government introduced a National Enclosure Act. So rather than having individual enclosure acts for each community, this was applied across the nation. And this allowed large plots of land to be owned by fewer farmers, which massively increased efficiency and encouraged farmers to experiment with things like crop rotation. They had more land to play with, so they were able to try out new techniques. Now, hundreds of thousands of small farmers lost access to their land that they'd been working on sometimes for generations, and this did drive them into the cities to find work. Now, many people see enclosure as a step towards the effective privatisation of Britain's land. Even today, the vast majority of land in England and Wales is owned by about 1% of the population, and many people see this as a step, as the removal from land from communities into private ownership. But this did really stimulate industrial development on the plus side. The increased food supply and move towards urbanisation was really stimulated by this Enclosure Act. So, where did all those people go from the countryside? They went into the factories and the mills. So the first mill was set up by Richard Arkwright in 1771. And this is very, very different to the cottage industries of the previous era. The factory system gathered large numbers of workers together and utilised machinery to increase productivity. So unemployed rural workers, mostly driven off by things such as the Enclosure Act, flocked to work in these mills. Women and children primarily were the first people to do this. But as yet more rural work was made obsolete, men also joined the workforce. Working conditions in these places were often quite dangerous though. They often had very, very long working hours, and children were often killed climbing under the machinery because they were small. They would repair the machinery and get caught and killed. Things like that, very common. And the factory system, as you can see, would define the British economy for over 100 years to come. and employ the vast majority of British workers right up until the 20th century. So now we're going to take a look at some of the impacts that the Industrial Revolution had. What all these changes in society, in technology, in the economy, what that did to society. So we've mentioned this briefly, but the population explosion can't be understated, really. As you can see from this graph here, show that, there we go. So the advances in technology and increased food supply caused the population of Britain to start exploding in the 18th and 19th century. And this trend continued really until the 20th century, and does continue in some ways. And as this graph illustrates, let me get it clear for you, the population of England and Wales went from 5.1 million in 1700 to 30.5 million in, just going to make sure that's clear, in 1901. This is an increase of sixfold in 200 years, which is obviously very, very large. There we go. Trying to get you so you can see that. Great. So, as well as a population explosion, urbanization was key, and an economic shift. So, as you can see from this image here on the left, these towns, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, millions and millions of people flocked to them. And the population of these major cities increased sevenfold in just 90 years. So that's a much bigger increase as in proportion with the rest of the population. And the chart on the right, this one here, also shows that income in agriculture is steadily falling as income in industry increases, and almost half of men are employed in industry by 1840. And the urban population shoots up from 17% of the population to 48% in 140 years. So this trend of urbanization and industrialization it happens all over the world in developing nations, but Britain was just really the first to experience it because it was the first to industrialize. So with all these people flocking to the cities, what impact did that have on public health? So, as masses and masses of people flocked to the urban centres, overcrowding and disease epidemics, such as the cholera epidemics of the 1830s, killed thousands of people. Working families were often crammed into tiny accommodation, and smoke from the factories caused people to have lung problems, especially young children. So the Great Stink of London in 1858 forced the government to act, and they built sewers across the city and forced local authorities, other local councils to do the same. The Great Stink was a period over the summer of 1858 in which the smell from excrement from the Thames was so appalling that Parliament actually couldn't meet, the members of Parliament couldn't be seated. So only once public sewerage had been provided and Louis Pasteur's germ theory of 1861 began to be more understood, did people find ways to actually avoid the spread of contagious disease. So you're only really into the beginning of the late 19th century do we see any changes in public health. Another very, very key element of the Industrial Revolution is class consciousness. So in 1700, isolated villages and communities were made up of labourers, artisans and lords, sort of the working sort, the middling sort and landed gentry. There was a distinction, but it wasn't very clearly defined. But by 1800, the banding together of thousands and thousands of workers created a sense of unified identity, particularly because they had no vote, no say in Parliament, most of the working people. So parliamentary reform was enacted in 1832 and 1867 to allow some working class men to vote, often men that earned, I think, over £10 a year or something, which is quite a lot of money in those days. But this was hard fought for. Even these small reforms were hard fought for. There were violent clashes on the streets. The 1819 Peterloo massacre resulted in 18 people being killed by the army in Manchester, just protesting for their right to vote. And only in 1918 did all working men and all women receive equal voting rights. So this division between the working classes, who do not own any property or capital and work for wages, and the middle and upper classes who do own property or capital, this would continue to define politics in the 19th and 20th century. So Marx and Engels' famous work on communism was based on the British class system, and the socialist traditions continue to emphasise this struggle between ordinary workers and those that own wealth and power, the business owners, the company owners, the factory owners, and this continues today. So, despite the working classes being slightly downtrodden in the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge economic expansion in the UK. So as you can see here from this chart, the United Kingdom, which is here, outperforms all other major global powers at this time in terms of manufacturing. Its economic output was much, much higher than Germany, France, the USA, and the UK was essentially the manufacturing centre of the world throughout this period, and this contributed to Britain's global dominance. So, finally, looking towards Britain's global dominance, the Industrial Revolution really empowered Britain as a nation. It enriched it beyond belief. So, looking here, this is an area of a map of the world of areas controlled by Britain during the height of the British Empire. So, let's discuss this domination. So, the British, before the Industrial Revolution, already had many colonies and had amassed resources and wealth due to the slave trade, which began in the 15th century. But after industrialisation, the British Empire was a vast global network of railways and steamboats, and they exported British goods and services and the English language and English culture to the rest of the globe. So this combination of industrialisation and empirical conquest flooded Britain with wealth, and manufacturing was key to the economy right up until the 1970s. And a vast navy and military was manufactured to ensure global dominance and keep Britain as a major military power. And this legacy actually defines Britain's place on the world, even today. We're still a major military power, considered to have a good navy. This all began in the Industrial Revolution. So, I believe that's it. That's it from me. So, thank you very much for listening. It was a brief outline, of what caused the Industrial Revolution, leading up to it, the changes it had, and the legacy that we still have from it today. So thank you very much.